Laura, is this COVID statement being read before just virtually every city meeting?
Yes, ma'am.
Uh-huh.
Do you have it? You'll be send it to
I
me?
have it. Yeah, I have a folder for it. So yeah.
I make a copy just in case y'all don't have it. So
Yeah.
then
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. And there comes Judge Scorsone, Dr. Potter, whom you know. And you see Ms. Queen on there. So
Yeah.
It's nice to see your face this time, Ms. Queen. You've been in the car or somewhere else.
Yes, I have. I had to travel over these last 2 meetings. And so I had to do that from my car phone, and I didn't want to turn the video on. It just, jumping around too much a bit.
Sure,
So I pulled over in some parking lots though. And
yeah. Well, at least
I
you
was
were driving and not trying to fly.
Right. Exactly. Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
we're still waiting for a few others, but for those of you who are new on, we're live on YouTube.
Ms. Persley, good afternoon. Ms. Fogel, good afternoon to you too.
Good afternoon.
Good to see both of you.
You as well.
Thank you. And Judge Murphy is about to come on. We're seeing her picture anyway.
I'm going to get to a place with better lighting, but here I am.
Now, can you get that light towards your face instead of in your back?
I'm going to switch around.
I see. And then there's Miss Baird. Okay, good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock and it is time to begin this meeting. So welcome to everyone who's here. Others will join us as they can. We have a guest speaker this afternoon, Dr. Gary Potter. But before we get to that, we have a couple of preliminary matters. And here comes Mr. Kozart. There's Ms. Gunther. And Judge Murphy is just relocating. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let me first start out by reading the statement required for this Zoom meeting. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic state of emergency and Governor Beshear's executive orders regarding social distancing, this meeting is being held via teleconference pursuant to Senate Bill 150 as signed by the governor on March 30, 2020, and Attorney General Opinion 2005, and in accordance with KRS 61.826, because it is not feasible to offer a primary physical location for the meeting. The second thing we need to do is to approve the minutes. You all have the minutes and I assume have had time to review them. Do I hear a motion to amend or approve the minutes?
Move to adopt.
Anyone?
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor say aye, please.
Aye.
Anyone in opposition say no. The motion carries and the minutes are approved. As we agreed, we have a guest speaker with us today, and this is Dr. Gary Potter. He is Professor Emeritus. That stamp on the Emeritus is fresh. The ink is not dry. He just retired this year. Professor Emeritus from the Eastern Kentucky University College of Justice and Safety. He has given us some materials. I would like for us to give him the opportunity to speak to us briefly. And then actually when he finishes, I'm going to call on some of you who I think may have questions. And if you don't, just say so, but I want to call on everybody, especially those who have made pertinent recommendations. And then we'll make sure everybody gets an opportunity to talk. And then we can have a general discussion. Dr. Potter, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for inviting me today. As I think some of you know, most of you know, I've been watching your work very carefully. And I've been impressed by your understanding of the issues, your ambition, and your tenacity, which is, I think, considerably required at this time. The information I'm going to present is based on national data. That's primarily because we don't have a whole lot of local data. I've restricted my sources to peer-reviewed scholarly publications. So There's no rumor or innuendo included. This is stuff that has been fairly well verified. Of course, I have opinions like everyone else does, but it's my intention to stick to the research. I think you've all received my written document, and unlike some of my colleagues who open their laptop, put up a PowerPoint, and then turn around and read it to the class, it's my intention to, as briefly as possible, summarize some of the high points of that document and then talk about a few recommendations for better research and better data, and then respond to any comments or questions you have. The bottom line, and actually the point I'm trying to make today, is that we need much better data and much better research on policing, particularly focused on use of force, de-escalation and training, and body-worn cameras, proactive policing. The information we have, what we know, is somewhat alarming. About 1,000 civilians every year are killed by law enforcement officers in the United States. Black men are 2.5 times more likely than white men to be killed by the police. Blacks who are killed by the police are twice as likely as whites in a similar situation to be unarmed at the time of the killing. We have information from 2 million 911 calls, which is a very large sample. We know that white officers, from that information dispatched to black neighborhoods, fire their guns 5 times as often as black officers dispatched for similar calls to the same neighborhoods. The probability of being black, unarmed, and shot by the police is about 3.5 times probability of whites in similar situations. And the racial bias in police shootings cannot be explained by crime rates. When we neutralize the data, when we run regression analysis against reported crime is not an explanatory variable. There are police tactics, police efforts, which are also relatively important to take a look at. We know all about stop and frisk. We also know that stop or frisk results in arrest or citation only 3% of the time with regard to a felony or a misdemeanor. We have a 7-year study of 95 million traffic stops in the United States. And incidentally, all of these studies I'm citing are recent. I didn't go back to 1980 or 1970. They're all post-2010. We find that black people are twice as likely to be pulled over as whites and 4 times as likely to be searched. That despite the fact that whites drive on average far more than black people do. Traffic searches, the searches that are occurred attendant to those stops, are likely to result in drugs or contraband being found far more often on white drivers than black drivers. And a fact which is interesting, I'll let you draw your own conclusions from it, I won't try to interpret it, that racial disparity disappears after dark. And you can try to figure out why that might be. There are all kinds of policing tactics which are worthy of examination. Dynamic entry and paramilitary police tactics are disproportionately used nationwide against Black and Latino people. Most of those raids are on people suspected of relatively low-level drug crimes. Studies of drug search warrants found that Black and Hispanic residents are significantly overrepresented as targets of drug search warrants, even after adjusting for drug usage rates. And one thing I want to point out, we do have a national survey on patterns of drug use conducted by the National Institute of Health that shows that 72% of all illicit drug users in the United States are white, regular drug users. I mean, by regular drug user, we mean once a week or more. In addition, searches of white suspects in those when those search warrants are served are far more successful in coming up with a targeted drug or other contraband than searches of either Black or Hispanic suspects. With regard to the drug war in general, Black people are 3.73 times more likely to be arrested for a marijuana offense, particularly marijuana possession, than white people are. 88% of marijuana arrests in the United States are for simple possession. And the current research seems to show, I won't say seems, does show, that those racial disparities are in fact growing over time. One of the areas where police do a lot more activity, are engaged in a lot more activity than violent crime, property crime, or even drug crime, are what I like to call petty crime. I suppose that's a matter of opinion. but basically misdemeanors and low-level felonies. In those cases, those arrests, in those cases, the black arrest rate is at least twice as high as the white arrest rate for disorderly conduct, drug possession, simple assault, theft, vagrancy, and vandalism. The black arrest rate for prostitution is 5 times higher than the white arrest rate, and the black arrest rate for gambling is 10 times higher among blacks than whites. That all leads us to a question of what we do about that and how we understand that. The way police collect data and systematic data collection is a real problem in police departments. Often results in a serious underestimation of bias and sometimes hide the bias altogether. But you have to understand is that only 40% of police agencies in the United States report NIBRIS data at all. That's a National Institute-based reporting system. And only 4% submit all of the requested data. That leaves huge gaps. There are factors that we can identify if we had better data that would help with police training and help with the overview of policing. For example, there are factors that can be easily identified through the simulations used in officer training that can tell us a whole lot about officer performance. There are biases that can be identified through screening using the MMPI and probably adding the Harvard implicit bias test that also can lead to identification of those factors. Research looking at simulations and MMPI interpretations find several predictive factors for potentially related to police bias in arrest and other things. One is obviously racism. Another is a bad temper, a kind of irritable temper, insecure masculinity. Other individual characteristics can be relatively easily identified, which lead to bias or troubling officer performance. There are also models, forecasting models, which would help us recognize patterns of bad behavior among officers. Research data tells us that officers who had repeated negative complaints and negative comments in their files were more than 3 times as likely to fire their guns as other officers. Disciplining or firing a police officer in the United States is enormously difficult. Union contracts constrain that aspect. In some states, we have the Bill of Rights for law enforcement officers, which shield some police officers from investigation into misconduct. The fact is that states have the constitutional power to license, revoke, deny the right of any individual to serve as a police officer. If a state agency was keeping track of an officer's disciplinary history, they might have taken Derek Chauvin out of the policing business years ago. Mr. Chauvin had 18 verified complaints against him before he put his knee on George Floyd's neck. Even officers who are fired for misconduct are frequently rehired. The police officer at Cleveland, Ohio, who fatally shot 12-year-old Tamir Rice, had previously resigned from another police department after that department had deemed him as unfit to serve. The best data we have, and again, it's limited because not all police departments report, is that 3% of current police officers presently serving as officers have been fired or had resigned in lieu of being dismissed from their previous departments. These officers are consistently found to commit more misconduct in the future compared to officers who had never been fired. We regularly and with some precision monitor the performance of doctors, of lawyers, and believe it or not, professors. We are constantly evaluated. We constantly have to answer to outside agencies for what we do. A fundamental question is, why don't we monitor the performance of police officers in a similar way? There are some things we can do. There are some police departments which collect details, fairly elaborate details, on how police officers respond to de-escalation tactics and techniques. It may surprise you to know that a city that takes the lead in that area is Oklahoma City, which is kind of strange. Every time an officer fails to engage in those appropriate tactics, note is made of it, and retraining usually occurs. The monitoring of de-escalation tactics and techniques has shown in the cities where it's used significant decreases in use of force numbers. In fact, I would argue that the mere collection of data holds police more accountable. Requirements that an officer file a report whenever they draw their gun, even if they don't fire that gun, are associated in the research with significantly reduced rates of gun death by police. Mandated use of body-worn cameras is one of the easiest ways to enhance accountability. The problem is that we don't often or always enforce that mandate. We know that when officers are using body-worn cameras, the likelihood of force being used by those officers is half that of other officers who don't have their cameras on or aren't using cameras. And we know that camera-wearing officers receive about 1/10 the number of complaints as other officers. The research also suggests fairly strongly that encouraging officers to listen to citizens, to listen to their views before they make a decision, and to demonstrate an interest in working with the community and with the people in the community is also effective. Police training based on fairly broad principles of procedural justice, which focuses on mutual respect, neutrality, and transparency, have also reduced both citizen complaints and use of force. There's also research, and it is fairly compelling, and there's a lot of it, that suggests that reallocating some of the current responsibilities of police agencies, especially those that police are not necessarily qualified to deal with, like homelessness, drug abuse, mental illness, other health problems, is fairly vital to reducing both the use of force and citizen complaints against the police. All of that's pretty important because you need to understand, we need to understand that there's an arrest made in the United States every 3 seconds, and that less than 5% of those arrests are for what anyone would call serious crimes. Real quickly, let me make some suggestions for the kind of data and the kind of research that needs to be done. We need to know what police do. There is some research on that, and most of it's local. There's some national research, but most of it's local. And understanding what police departments actually police is relatively important. We know, for example, that about 1 to 1.5% of police contacts, police calls, involve violent crime. Now that takes up about 4 to 5% of police time, because obviously they spend more time on those cases. But the other categories of police activity that have been found in the research are a little less compelling. There's that 14% of contacts that are in that amorphous category of anything else, all other crimes, all other misdemeanors, all other things. There's mental health and medical issues. There's traffic. One of the areas that concerns me the most, and that I think needs to be looked into in almost every police department, is the fact that it appears nationally that about 35% of police contacts, in other words, times police are dispatched through 911, involve non-criminal calls. That means that about 1 out of 3 police encounters involve non-criminal matters, and the obvious question is, why are police responding to that at all? Well, of course, the answer is that someone, somewhere, for some reason, observes or thinks that they have seen or heard something suspicious or something annoying or something that doesn't look quite right. And that suspicion results in a 911 call. It's my contention, and there are enough judges here to tell me if I'm wrong, that there's a huge difference between suspicion and the legal standard of reasonable suspicion, which entails a police contact, which requires a police contact. Reasonable suspicion has to be based on specific and articulable facts, taken together with rational inferences drawn from those facts. I think that making that distinction between something doesn't look right and something actually requires intervention by the police is an area we can actually work on. Clearly, one way to avoid conflict is to avoid unnecessary hostile contact. There's no real way to be perfect in estimating police activity. The easiest way to do it, the way most places have, the way I would recommend doing it, is through an analysis of 911 dispatch calls. How many came in? How many did the police respond to? And what were the outcomes of that response? Now, in other cities where that's been done, the outcome of the response has been a citation or an arrest or a scolding in less than 5% of the calls. And there's a question about whether it's necessary to engage in responses to all of those kinds of amorphous complaints and worries. Second thing we need is a victimization survey. That's hard. We have a national victimization survey. We have some local ones. But it's important because most people make their judgments about crime based on crime rates. Crime rates are the numbers reported to NIBRIS and the UCR, the Uniform Crime Reports. Crime rates don't estimate crime at all. They tell us what the police are doing. They tell us where the police are located. They tell us what the emphasis of police departments are at any given time, but they don't tell us about the distribution of crime. And when we compare police reported crime activity to the NCVS, the numbers are very, very different. So a victimization survey for Lexington, Fayette County would be a very good idea. I attached a link to a victimization survey that was done in Kentucky a few years ago. I'm not endorsing it or saying that it's a great survey, but it's an example of what those surveys are. Lots of cities, and it's particularly common in Europe, but it's also becoming common in the United States, use a citizens assessment. A survey of citizens asking questions about what they consider to be crime issues, about the police department, an assessment of what the police or what citizens rather than the police think about enforcement policies or think about crime problems. Helps, I think, a whole lot to clarify what the community expects of a police force. This is fairly common practice in Britain, and just briefly, without wasting a whole lot of time, the British were quite surprised that they mandated these kinds of community services surveys beginning in the middle of the 1990s. Everyone expected the responses to be the number one crime problem is drugs, or the number one crime problem is snatch and grab or robbery. It turned out those items were toward the bottom of the surveys every time. The number one problem identified in almost every precinct in England at that time was domestic violence. And that did change. The police did alter their efforts in that direction. I also think that it's real important that complaints against the police be taken seriously. Right now, as has been described to you, the resolution of those complaints remains within the department itself, eventually finding its way to the chief, and if required, if some action is required, onto the city council. It might be a good idea to have an outside review of formal and informal complaints about police. They could characterize the types of complaints, and they could look to see if there are officers with clusters of complaints and identify potential problem areas. Next, we need body cam assessment. If body cams are mandated, they should be on. If they're not on, then we need to know why. Is there an equipment failure? Is there a failure by the officer? And we need to have fairly accurate statistics and understanding of that. Now, lastly, and I am hurrying along because you have work to do and you don't need me talking to you. What you have talked about in the subcommittee is a few things that resonated with me, and if I could just briefly address them. There's been a discussion of something like a citizen's advocate who would facilitate the filing of complaints. That seems both workable and highly desirable. It would be best if that position was located outside of the police department. Let's face it, when you have to go into the police department to file a complaint against the police, that's going to reduce the number of complaints or the number of issues that actually come to anyone's attention. If that position were outside the police department, maybe in the city attorney's office, maybe in the city council, maybe in DPA, maybe in the court system itself, it would work a whole lot better. That advocate should do three things. They should help potential complainants write their complaints. That's a prodigious task for a lot of people, and a little professional assistance would help. They should have the power to assemble supporting evidence, any witness statements, any videos from witnesses on phones, and any excuse me, information held by the department itself. And they should be the person that submits the formal complaint to the police department. One caution is that those things have been tried in other places, and they've not been terribly successful because they have not been properly supported or properly funded. And that's an important consideration. I've also heard discussion of what's been called an inspector general. I'm not sure if that's the right term to use, but the idea that someone in the system somewhere outside the police department, perhaps serving the city council, perhaps serving the mayor, perhaps serving the courts, has the capacity to review, request, and interpret data and address community concerns and come to some conclusion about those concerns and that data. Once again, that position could be housed in the city council or the mayor's office. And I would look at it as more a research position than any kind of enforcement position. We need reevaluation and outside evaluation of police training and organization. There should be an external assessment of police training curricula. There should be external assessment of the role of field training officers. And frankly, policing is a bureaucracy, and all bureaucracies from time to time need to be looked at in terms of the organization of the bureaucracy itself. Integrating training and retraining with day-to-day operational issues should be a really high priority. If there is someone who is consistently having problems, they should be retrained. They should have to go back to training. They should be pulled off the street. There are all kinds of ways to do that, but in general, that's a fairly good idea. And lastly, we've heard concepts of guardianship and procedural justice and community policing. Researchers know that shifting from that warrior mindset, that war on crime mindset, to a community mindset where officers value working with the public is absolutely vital to both controlling crime and to improving relationships with the police. There are a couple of ways to do it. The most common strategy recommended by researchers is what's called procedural justice, which focuses on impartiality as the governing principle in interactions with the community. So procedural justice emphasizes fairness, consistent outcomes, unbiased treatment, and the protection of human rights over crime control. The basic goals of procedural justice are equal treatment, non-discrimination, and nonpartisanship. There's also a lot of talk about community policing, and Lord knows there are a lot of books written about community policing, which is interesting because we have it, but we never really tried it. We've never really done it the way it's supposed to be. The idea of community policing is that police work and build close ties with members of the community. A lot of police departments have advertised their community policing programs and have simply not implemented them. The general idea, and I'll cut this very short, is that we take officers, we take them out of their cars, we put them on foot patrol, we assign officers permanently to a neighborhood. The same officers stay in that neighborhood, not for the entire 20 years of their career, but for at least a prolonged period of time. They get to know that neighborhood, they get to know the people in it. And policing is carried out from a decentralized local neighborhood locale. There are all kinds of elements of community policing. I'm not going to go through them. I attached the principles of community policing, which were adopted by the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department after the unfortunate incidents there. And I think they're good. They might be a little wishful, but I think they're very good. And I'm going to stop there and hear from you, or not hear from you, whatever you prefer.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Potter. That was a really quick review of the materials you gave us as homework. I I want to call on a few people to see whether they have questions of you, and then we'll open it up generally. And I guess first I want to talk to Ms. Minifield because she's done some work on this already, and ask you, Ms. Minifield, do you have any questions for Dr. Potter?
Sister Minifield, Sister Kaufman, let me break in real quick with a quick housekeeping
Okay.
thing. Keep in mind, those that are viewing on YouTube, of the racial justice at lexingtonky.gov. Also, it's come to our attention that the chat was disabled at the beginning of this meeting. That was a carryover from a previous meeting. So hopefully now on YouTube Live, you will be able to interact and chat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I see you sent me a message that asked me to call on you, and I didn't see it. Okay. Oh, well, Ms. Minifield, maybe that gave you a moment. And I just want to give you first shot at this because you've spent a lot of time on this already. Do you have questions for Dr. Potter?
I do not. I think that he is correct. And I think that that's what we're trying to do, is what he has recommended, the outside review of complaints, you know, once the actual filing, I mean, and I know Brianna's in charge of the pre-filing, and then my area was mostly post-filing, you know, where we got to from that. And I've read what Brianna sent around about, you know, our suggestion or my suggestion that maybe it could go through the, you know, someone other than the police. And I've read her response to that and after her conversations with the police, but I still think that that's a possible and a doable situation. And then as for the post filing, I agree with, you know, we've called it an inspector general type of position, and that we believe that it needs to be at an investigative stage and not at the enforcement stage, you know, in order for it to be as fair as possible, because most times we understand that the conclusion is pretty much going to be based on what is presented. And so we've got to make sure what we present is thorough and correct and as transparent as possible. So I agree with Dr. Potter, and I appreciate everything that he said.
Great, thank you. Ms. Percy, I want to turn to you and ask you, do you have any questions of Dr. Potter? Because you've made your own recommendations.
Currently, I do not.
Let me get my record right for a special judge case.
You know, we're having some background.
All right, we have.
I'm sorry, we're having some background noise. Okay, now, Ms. Percy, try that again.
Okay. I do think some of the things that were said were very helpful, Dr. Potter, so thank you. A lot of the stuff that I'm still working on are in progress, so what he has recommended and what he has said, I'll definitely take that moving forward. But then helping with either, you know, making those recommendations a little bit stronger, or trying to find a way to work in something that would be doable in regards to someone assisting with those complaints in the process.
Thank you. Judge Scorsone, you at the last meeting were talking about amending some of the thing, or not amending, but offering additions to some of the things Ms. Minifield was recommending. Do you have any questions of Dr. Potter? And by the way, thank you for suggesting that he come here today.
Thank you. Actually, what I would ask, and I mean, you've presented incredibly compelling data, Dr. Potter. And as you know, we've talked about a lot of issues, a lot of concerns in this subcommittee. It's always, I think, important to kind of target and to kind of try to push for the most meaningful things. So if you were advising us on the issue of racism in law enforcement, what could be, say, the three most significant things that we could do to try to minimize, you know, incidents of racism in law enforcement?
Probably the first thing is relates to training and selection and hiring. We really need to pay attention to that. That's a hard area to deal with. We in the United States differ from almost everyone else in the world. We have police training, which is far less effective than that in European countries, and where actually people go to police colleges and are 3 or 4 years from getting on the street. And those colleges also maintain contact with the officer being trained. I think the training and selection is extremely important. Evaluation of data, if we get it, is very important. There are a number of things that easily are done with data. One of the things we could do with computer programs that I understand already exist is to look at every police citizen interaction and then look for problems in those interactions or clusters of problems in those interactions and connect them back to the training curriculum. In other words, move people off the street to try and deal with the issues that they have before they're put back on the street. And then the department can do what they choose. They can put them back, continue to train them, or discipline them in some way. And lastly, and this isn't really the problem of this committee, it's the problem of everybody, all the subcommittees. One thing that works everywhere in Europe and everywhere else where it is tried is an adequate social safety net. Very simply, you can't have people out there whose only place to get help is the police. People with mental health problems have to be able to access mental health facilities. And they have to be able to do it without waiting 6 weeks to get in. People with serious health problems have to have access to health care. Educational systems have to be adequate no matter where they are in the city, no matter how much property tax is paid related to any given school. Those kinds of social services, issues dealing with income, with housing, aren't really law enforcement issues, but if you're really interested in reducing crime, that's really where you have to put some attention. Does that help?
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Masadi, you had your hand up. Do you have anything you want to ask him? You're muted, actually. You're muted.
It's a terrible screen that I have that I said without a password, I can't get on the iPad. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Potter. I agree with you on your 3 principles. On your training, I would probably venture a guess that a lot of your graduates from the College of Law Enforcement become police officers. Am I correct?
That is correct.
So wouldn't that have something to do with the curriculum that maybe you could somehow either change or have some of your colleagues change, because you recognize that there is an issue here? Because not only do they graduate from the College of Law Enforcement and go into a criminal justice position, whether it's police or whether it's something affiliated with that, maybe federal position, there's also the issue of training. And you've got, KLEC down there, and they go through weeks and weeks, plus Lexington has their own academy of 39 weeks. So I guess I would ask you specifically, what could you add to that curriculum that would make the training better? Because we've got you've got a 4-year college degree, most of them are coming out with law enforcement or criminal justice or whatever. You've got weeks and weeks of training. So where are we missing the boat?
I'm not certain how many Lexington police officers have degrees and how many of them have from EKU. I know some EKU graduates end up in Lexington. Training is conducted at Eastern, but it is separate from the college itself. It is the Bureau of Training, which is state mandated. We would like to see a whole lot more discussion of non-enforcement issues like social and behavioral sciences, discussions of race, ethnicity, poverty, discussions of ethics. I'd like to see a de-emphasis on the warrior mentality. And one of the things that keeps coming through is this idea of a fairly pervasive idea of police training of danger. Yeah, there's danger. There's danger of being a police officer, absolutely. But emphasizing that and continuing to emphasize that, I think undoes a whole lot of what we try to do with folks in our curriculum, which is making them a little more sensitive and a little more understanding of the folks that they're dealing with. I think that an external review of training, since Lexington is separate from the state facility, especially by people who know about that, and that would not be me. There are a lot of people who have been doing training and have studied training for a long time. is called for. I think that just like colleges have to revise and review their curriculum every 2 or 3 years, social training programs.
And I don't disagree with you. I'm just saying, what a resource with the College of Law Enforcement down there. I mean, you've got probably one of the best colleges in the country as far as criminal justice, and if that resource can be tapped into to help us with our Lexington police officers in tandem, we've checked off one of your boxes already. As far as your data, I get it. There's not enough collection, and the social support, that's a huge issue. I mean, that's a major issue to have to deal with, just the way of life and way of thinking. But we do at the in Lexington have a citizens advocate, which is part-time but has no subpoena powers. So that may be somewhere to start as far as someone that's objective and outside the police department, that is in-house in the government already and familiar with government procedures. So that's an option. And that's all I have.
Yes, I think so. I think that's a good idea. And I don't want to be gratuitous, but I would tell you that if we controlled the Bureau of Training, the curriculum might be substantially different than the one that's offered statewide now.
And maybe that's not a bad idea. I mean,
No, I think it's a good idea, but the state apparently disagrees.
Ms. Queen, I'm sorry, you finish, Councilwoman Masadi.
If you've got some great minds with great resources and they're both housed in the same facility, I would think there could be some kind of collaboration. So.
Okay. Ms. Queen, you had some questions.
Yes, and thanks, Dr. Potter, for being here today, and appreciate that very much. And, and I wanted to add to Councilmember Mazzotti's thoughts about, I think the impression is that the folks over in the criminology department at EKU are very engaged with the law enforcement training. And I wanted to know, I have heard that is not true. So I would like to know, are you all majorly, engaged in the training of law enforcement, or is that, very specific to criminal justice? Most of them are, I think, retired officers and sergeants and leaders throughout Kentucky that are a part of those who train other officers. But I don't believe the theories of criminology and social justice and certainly those types of explorations are a part of that learning for law enforcement, but I may be mistaken.
No, that's true. It's a very different kind of education than across the parking lot in the college building. I think that occasionally some of our faculty still do guest appearances once in a while over there, but for the most part, that is what I like to refer to as technical training. How to drive a car in a chase on a wet surface, how to use a baton, how to one of the basic things about police training, and I have no objection to this, it does take up a lot of time, is that the point of police training is to provide a buffer for departments against civil liability. So yes, we taught them that. Yes, we taught them the law. Yes, we taught them what they could do and they couldn't do. And that's important, but it's only part of the being a police officer. Let me just say, since two of you have mentioned collaboration, I'm going to throw someone under the bus now. I'm gone. Dean Kapler, who was a former police officer in Lexington, is gone, is retired. Our new dean is Derek Paulson. Some of you may know him. He was, for 10 years, the commissioner of planning, and the rest of the title went on forever in Lexington. He's an expert on tactical crime analysis, crime mapping, criminal justice and planning. You might want to talk to Derek and see what could be worked out in terms of resources, assistance, and some ideas. He knows both the city government, which I don't know very well. He knows law enforcement and criminal justice very well, and he has those technical skills in analysis and knows where to find additional skills that might be abused. And there are a lot of talented faculty still left down there. We have statistical wizards. who do stuff that I don't even pretend to understand. We have some people with a lot of experience in various aspects of the system. And there are other universities as well. I'm not trying to cut out UK, which has a great geography department, which could be of use to you, or Louisville, which has a criminal justice department. But there is a connection with Eastern, and maybe it would be a good idea to put the new dean on the hot spot and see what he's willing to do.
Judge
I'm sure he's
Murphy,
going to be very angry with me for that.
thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Powder. Judge Murphy, you had some questions.
I did. Thank you, Dr. Potter, for this this review. And so I tried to, I didn't have my notepad, I had to find one. But your first thing that I had a question about was you said that there should be some sort of external review or review to review clusters of, I guess, police activity or police misconduct with officers. And I guess my question is this kind of like an after action review committee? And then since based on your report, you just said that right now, a lot of police departments aren't basically sending this information to a national collective of how to keep that information to prevent these officers from being rehired somewhere if there is noted to these review clusters. What's your thought on that? Am I understanding that to be like an after action type of review?
Yes, partially.
Okay.
The need for a national directory of all officers who have had complaints against them sustained is fairly obvious. Whether we get it or not is another thing. An after action report is a fact gathering exercise, as I understand it. I would like to see added to that the analysis of relatively easily obtained data that may or may not have resulted in a complaint that monitors police and civilian citizen interactions and looks for what I meant by a cluster was officers who had a series of problems. It could be a complaint, it could be, oh, the body cam's not on, it could be any number of things that violate departmental rules, or that violate common sense, and be able to statistically analyze that, identify those officers, and essentially put them through the training curriculum again and hope that corrects it.
And so for that, should that be something that our local police is doing anyway? Or do you think it needs to be a citizens type of situation that then reports back to Commissioner of Public Safety or something saying, hey, we've noted these things, what have you all done?
I think that that the data should be collected by the department. I think it should in fact be a requirement that they collect that data. I think the analysis of that data can be and maybe should be outside of the department.
Okay. I had two more questions, and I'm sorry.
Okay.
You had said under the Citizens Advocate, and Ms. Persley or Brianna and I had discussed this because having worked at the city, I know that the current position of the Citizens Advocate reports to the council, and this, if we were to put this job description under them, would completely change what they were hired to do. But what would you believe their background and experience, because I'm helping to write a complaint, power to assemble, supporting, so almost kind of a subpoena power. I think that individual just has to have some background in order to write a cohesive complaint. And so what does that, just what your recommendation on how we would put that inside our recommendation that we already have?
Off the top of my head, if I were looking, and this may limit it too much, if I were looking for someone in terms of educational qualification, I would look for someone with a criminal justice degree. I would look for someone with a social work degree. Certainly writing reports and taking statements and gathering information is an integral part of social work, maybe even more so than criminal justice. And then people have to be evaluated on the basis of the skills that you require. People coming out of our college have done some interesting things other than policing. I was just in previous discussion. I have two of my best former graduate students who work for DPA in Lexington. I have one of my best former graduate students who runs a human trafficking nonprofit in Indiana. So we do things other than just policing. We're turning out maybe too many PhDs from other places, but the competition there is getting intense. But they do a variety of other things, and a lot of them end up in more social service jobs than police jobs.
Judge Murphy, I would also say that Laura Hatfield just reminded Mr. Cozart and me that the mayor is putting together an after action review committee, and this committee could recommend this group include the data he's talking about.
And I was aware of that. That's why I wanted to know specifically what that was. And this is my last question, and I won't hog up the time. Your last statement, you were talking about like that there needs to be a review always of that outside review of the training, the biases, and the organizational structure. And, you know, I know that our police department, every police department goes through that kind of accreditation type of thing. So do we leave it to those groups to do that? Or do you think this should be also a citizens thing to review, and who should have that kind of knowledge to be able to do that evaluation properly? And thank you again for being with us.
Sure. Obviously, they have to go through the requirements of their own accreditation. So that has to be within the police department. There are, again, any number of folks who are qualified to look at that data externally and make some judgments about whether changes should be made. I would look at the law school. I would look, once again, at social work. I would look at mental health social work. I'd look at our very best graduate students. And I'd look at folks from other programs as well. We have an intriguing program in the Department of Psychology at EKU, which is called Social Intelligence, which is designed totally around respectful, useful, productive communication. A minor in that would not hurt.
Okay. Ms. Gunther, you had some questions.
Yes, Dr. Potter, I want to kind of piggyback off of Judge Murphy's comment. You were talking, I know that you said that you wouldn't call it IG but this citizens advocate. You state that it shouldn't be in the police department, and I agree with that. But you said that possibly with the courts, possibly in one of the prosecution agency, the prosecutorial agencies, but, you know, I'm more practical. And, you know, sometimes the look of things is everything. So, you know, most folks who have encounters with the police are not arrested, they're not criminals, and what their attitudes are about the police are formed around that benign contact. So, and a lot of times they associate a prosecutor with the police. So with that, I couldn't even see that position could even be in the county or in the Commonwealth. I don't see how. I mean, what do you think about that?
I was making a distinction in my head, which may not be a real one, between the Commonwealth Attorney's Office and the City Attorney's Office.
Yeah.
I would definitely
the city attorney. Okay.
I would definitely not house it in the Commonwealth Attorney's Office. No.
Okay.
It's totally there.
Well, or in the county, right?
The only reason for the city attorney is they know how the bureaucracy, the city bureaucracy works, and they also obviously have an ability to write and understand the law, and that seems to be a fairly good place to put it. But it could also be equally, if you really want to encourage people, in DPA.
Yeah, I had Ms. Queen. I got two more questions, if I could. Yeah. Okay, Dr. Powder. You also, there is this for police discipline. When we first started, Chief Maynard said that there's a 5-year look back on discipline, and I get that you don't want to hold someone to this. We're not who we are today. That we're not the same person that we're going to be 20 years from now. I get it. However, when it's the same type of problem, shouldn't that be used? Because I mean, sometimes you just can't, can't change the stripe. Mm-hmm. And so we just have to get beyond the 5 years and we can do the same thing again. So when it's the same type of behavior that's discouraged, shouldn't that 5-year look back go away when it's the same type of behavior, no matter how long ago it was?
I would think so. And as I said, we evaluate lawyers, doctors, the professors, and we don't limit the time. If you committed malpractice 7 years ago, that's something that should be noted. And God knows if you're a professor, student comments or issues with your teaching or issues with your research follow you every step of your career throughout your entire career.
And my last question is that, as Judge Murphy said, you know, the police department goes through an accreditation process. They're about to undergo that. They ask at that point for, you know, some citizen comment. Why do we need to wait to do that for accreditation? If you have contact, when the police officer is giving you a citation, why can't they give a card and say, you know, fill out this, go online, let me know how I did, or, I mean, whether it's good or bad. At that point, anytime there's a contact, that the citizen is allowed to make a comment about that contact with that police officer. And then we could use that data that is so, you know, sorely missing because we only do it for certain things. What about that?
That seems a good idea. And it also seems, as you said, a much easier way to accumulate the data. And again, I hate to go back to education, but I will. We have to evaluate our courses. And after 36 years, I have a ton of student comments, most of them good, some not all, but I don't get to edit them. I don't get to hand in only the good ones. When we are evaluated every 2 years, or when we're evaluated for promotion, we have to turn them all in. And I think there's merit to that.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Dr. Potter, let me ask you a couple of questions. You mentioned an external review of training, and you said you're not the one to do it, but who would be the one to do it?
There are researchers who specialize in looking at training and hiring. There are folks who have spent a considerable amount of time in other training programs. I know there are people who work for the college that I came from who had previously worked for the Bureau of Training. There are all kinds of people who could do it.
So you're saying at EKU, there are some people?
There are, and also other places. I don't think it has to be someone necessarily with a policing background. I would like to see a mix of folks, someone with a psychology degree, someone from law school, someone from criminal justice, and someone actually with experience in police training, who's been to police trainings, who's been to there's several annual meetings where police departments discuss police trainings, and I've heard some interesting stories from those about the kinds of things that some police chiefs want, which seem entirely inappropriate. All those things could be mixed together. Remember that once you have data, once you have information, any trained researcher can analyze it. And they don't have to have a particular point of view. They don't have to have a particular background to do that. So that's something that could be discussed with any number of institutions.
You also mentioned a victimization survey. Who could help design that survey instrument? Could we find someone, say, at UK or at EKU to do that?
Certainly, you could find someone at either place to do that. There are all kinds of victimization surveys. The one used by the Census Bureau is extremely long and very complex, and also very good because of that. Mm-hmm. There are shorter versions of that if you're just trying to get a pulse of the community. Anyone who conducts survey research, no matter what their background, could easily put together and analyze a victimization survey.
Okay. All right. Is there anybody who hasn't already asked a question of Dr. Potter who wants to ask a question? How about you, Mr. Cozart? Anything from you?
Yeah, I do have something. Hey, Judge, also prepare yourself to, well, I'll say that next. Early in your presentation, you mentioned, I believe it's in context of the disparities of stops and searches and discoveries. You stop short of making your inference, and I'm not asking you to do it now. I just want to make sure I understand the content. You said that disparity stops after dark.
Yes.
Rehearse that.
With regard to traffic stops, yes.
As if to imply at a certain juncture of the day, and you're in large, this is national, you qualified that, as if to imply that at some juncture, folks were left to their own devices in those neighborhoods that were policed heavily, or?
I think the implication drawn by the researcher is that at some point in moving cars at night, race is harder to discern.
Okay.
I get you.
Okay. Okay. All right, Ms. Queen, you had a question.
Yes, that and kind of a comment too is talking about, stops. One of the pieces is about the perception, that is related to legitimacy that the police department has with the citizens and the citizens have with the police department. And a lot of that, I think, is connected to police stops or stop and frisk or with searches or in areas in which that, the question of, are you treating me like you're treating everybody else? And how far are you going? And when you stop me, do you proceed the same way in a traffic stop than you treat everybody else when you stop? And that goes to your point, Dr. Potter, about the whole point of after dark and the research that's wrapped around all of that I understand. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that legitimacy, that's also kind of related, I think, to Dr. Tyler's research about, the legitimacy in policing and the relationship aspect of all of that as it relates to police stops and searches and very specific things that have to do with data collection and the importance of collecting that data.
The importance of data collection is to find out exactly those questions, exactly who's being stopped, why they're being stopped, what's being done about it, what the outcome is. If there's no outcome, then we might wonder why the stop occurred at all. And also to try to isolate bias. And that's hard to do. Everybody comes from their own set of assumptions about everything. Those assumptions are not sufficient to rise to the level of an interrogation, a stop, frisk, or a traffic search. You have to have a reason. That's why I brought up the idea of reasonable suspicion as opposed to suspicion. I can walk out of my door after I'm done here and I can see suspicious stuff all over my neighborhood. I'm not going to call the cops. It's something that doesn't look right to me, fine, no big deal. We need to be able to more clearly define when police intervention in those situations are necessary. When someone's paranoid reaction to a branch banging on their house, or someone looking out their window and saying, "Oh, that person doesn't belong in this neighborhood. There must be something up." That doesn't rise to a level of intervention in my judgment. With that said, I'll tell you a quick story. Years ago, the Southern Criminal Justice Association was meeting in New Orleans, and Dr. Kapler and I drove down there together. And on the way back, Dr. Kapler, who is probably the leading expert in the United States on police civil liability, was driving and was pulled over by the Memphis Drug Task Force. And just because the car we were driving fit the profile, that's not good enough. And I think he kind of explained that to them at the time.
Let me just interrupt here. Quinn, Dr. Price asked if you would please let her into the Zoom meeting. Can you do that?
You got it.
Thank you very much. Okay. All right. There you are, Dr. Price. Thank you. I'm glad you're with us today. And I know Dr. Price has done her homework and read Dr. Potter's handout. So she can chime in anytime she wants. Who else has questions of Dr. Potter at this point? Anybody? Judge Isaac.
Okay. Yes, Doctor, again, thank you for being here and thank you for your work. You had earlier talked about the fact that everybody says they have community policing, but they don't really have community policing. And is that specific to the Lexington Police Department? You think that it could be more of a community policing entity than it is? Or does it not do it at all? Or are you in a position?
I really can't evaluate that because I don't have the data. I don't have the information about community policing in Lexington other than what's in their annual reports, which are very nicely done. I don't have information about their proactive policing programs on gangs and what they say are mid-level drug wholesalers to make any kind of judgment at all. You have to have the information and you have to have the data. The problem with community policing most places, I'll try to make this as simple as possible, is you can't put people on the street during the day and have them be officer friendly and have them trying to relate to folks in the community. And then as soon as they're off the street, have someone come with a quasi-military unit come in with a search warrant and start serving search warrants and arrest warrants. That doesn't work. You have to go one way or the other. You can't do both. And that's where most police departments fail.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Baird.
Hi, I did have, well, it's kind of morphed into two questions now. One of them was based on your last statement, and we've talked about it on this call, and then you kind of brought it up, which led me into this. And we were talking about sort of the level of intervention of the police, and depending on the type of call, why do we send an officer out to do whatever when it's somebody that's intoxicated or the branch hitting the wall or whatever. So I'm, I guess, trying to look to see what that looks like, because my guess is it would be a situation where 911 caller says, I'm scared because I'm hearing something on my window. I think somebody's breaking in, those types of things. They're not going out to investigate because they're afraid. And so police officer comes out, and then after the fact, they realize it's the branch on the window. Or someone that's got, you know, a mental health issue. They're calling by saying, this person is harassing, or this person, you know, he's in the street or intoxicated in the street, and those types of things. So there's been comments about, you know, why send a police officer, send a mental health person or whatever, but you may not necessarily know that that's the issue until an officer goes out there. So is there some thought that you have on that? You know, we kind of analyze it after the fact, but like in the moment, is there some thought about how that should not happen or something different about that?
Well, information, more complete information can be taken when the call comes in to see if there is in fact some reason to send a police officer. A police officer can go if someone's scared because there's a branch banging on the window or something, and find the branch without interrogating or stopping or frisking anyone. And that's fine. But I also suspect, and we don't know because we simply don't have data on it, and it's relatively easy data to get. Police dispatch data should be readily available. I suspect there's also a whole lot of, as I tried to describe it before, this just doesn't look right calls. There's someone here someone in this neighborhood who doesn't belong in this neighborhood. There's someone who appears out of place. There's someone who's acting in a way that makes me uncomfortable. Well, being made uncomfortable is not a situation in which someone who has the authority to use deadly force needs to respond, in my opinion.
Okay, so in those situations, like a caller calls and says, or somebody's suspicious, he's been walking back and forth or whatever, your thought is the 911 caller taker get more information and then either not send somebody or send whom?
Well, you might ask precisely what it is that that person's doing. And if it doesn't come close to anything related to a criminal complaint, simply advise the person that probably an officer will not come. But if the situation gets worse, or if they have more specific information, they can always try again. I don't think that, I think we actually encourage the overuse of police resources and the 911 system by emphasizing fear among people. The idea that, the slogan, if you see something, say something. Maybe not. Maybe if you see something and it's really not terribly important, you should keep it to yourself. Or, I hate to be flippant, but listen to a calming app for a few minutes before you call 911.
Gotcha. So then I'm taking it, because you're mentioning the research and the data, that Chief Maynard has sent a lot of it. A lot of it.
A lot.
A lot. And it's such an understatement, a lot of it. But no, appreciate it. But it sounds like it could be something that we could, we as in mayor, could pay a researcher to analyze the data that he has and would know what additional data needed in order to get more of the specifics, like you've done one that's kind of national, that could get more of the specifics specifically related to Lexington. That could be, I guess, a recommendation. Okay.
I think that'd be a great idea. And some of it's complicated. Chief Maynard can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 911 dispatch is separate from the police department in Lexington.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
And so that requires some navigating of the bureaucracy. So it doesn't necessarily have to come from the police department in that case.
Thank you, Ms. Bayer. Sheriff Witt, did you have your hand up? Yeah, a long time ago.
That's okay. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Potter, for joining us today. I just had a couple of 3 short questions for you. We're doing a lot of talk about training, and of course we can all improve on training, and that's one of the priorities I think that we should focus on. But I'm sure you're aware that the Kentucky Law Enforcement Council is an independent body that approves all the curriculum that certified law enforcement instructors are then able to teach other sworn officers. So are you saying that that independent body is not sufficient in approving the curriculum?
That independent body has a fairly narrow interest. They are more than capable of devising a curriculum related to actual police tactics, civil liability, all that kind of stuff. The question then becomes, is that sufficient? And my argument would be, no, it is not. That we need to broaden out from that. Yeah.
Okay. And then I'm sure you're also aware of the decertification form and the law. I know Assistant Chief Maynard sent that to our committee when we first started. And I know it's relatively new, but have you done any research on the success of decertification of officers in Kentucky? Or have any of your colleagues?
I've looked at the list of decertified officers in Kentucky, which was published, I believe, by USA Today, maybe 2 months ago. It was a fairly long list, but the problem there is the same. That is a long path to decertification, and it may well be that it's in the interest of a police department to intervene with that officer prior to even getting to that level, prior to the issue or the problem raising itself to the level of decertification, which does require a substantial offense. I mean, as I recall that list, there was some guy who stole a boat and some other stuff on it. It requires that you really do stuff. Whereas some problems in police departments, there are still problems, may not rise to that level. Does that make sense?
It does, but I think it depends on the agency's disciplinary process and so forth. So I think it's probably depending upon the agency. And then over the last 5 years, have you watched the evolution of the FBI's national use of force data collection? And that's intended, of course, to capture use of force incidents across the country. And what are your thoughts on that?
it's an interesting start, but it is handicapped by the same problem as the NIBRIS and the UCR, which is lack of department participation, lack of full data submission, incomplete data submission, and in that case, to some degree, allowing for a subjective interpretation at the local level of what constitutes the data that should be reported.
Yeah, I think the data element sets are pretty robust.
Yeah.
I had some involvement in it early on, and I think compared to UCR, I think the data elements are a lot more robust, and I think NIBRS will be more robust compared to UCR as well when the sun sets on UCR.
The FBI keeps promising that, and they keep saying that there'll be greater participation. And
Yeah.
that's true, that participation does increase every year, but it's still a slow process. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, good. Thank you, Sheriff. Other questions? Judge Corsoni, you had your hand up.
Just briefly, in Lexington, we're interested in trying out something like the Eugene, Oregon, I think it's called the Cahoots plan, where they hired a healthcare and social worker to respond to some of these calls. I presume that there's a component there of retraining or additional training for the 911 callers. And then also, if say Lexington wanted to try it out as a pilot project here, what kind of advice would you give on trying it out?
I don't know. That's a hard question, because the first issue, and it's an issue that is difficult for the city council, the mayor, and everyone else, is that those people that you're going to send out have to be employed and be available, and have to be available throughout the city in relatively short time. So how you do that without having a robust mental health, homelessness, drug system already in place is difficult to imagine. Eugene, I think that's a relatively new program. I don't think it's been going on all that long. And I think they started out in a relatively small part of the city and have expanded out. That's pretty much how you have to do it. That would fit with the community policing model. If you decentralized policing and had police in a specific neighborhood, you could also have mental health professionals, you could have practical nurses, you could have psychiatric social workers also in the same area. Whether they were assigned to the police department or the health department or whatever would be a matter you'd all have to figure out depending on how Lexington works.
Okay, Chief Maynard, I think you had your hand up.
Thank you, Judge. Dr. Potter, the kind of following up on that with the Eugene, Oregon, are you familiar with the community paramedicine program that we have currently in Lexington?
Yes, and it's a good one. And I meant to mention that before when I was throwing people under the bus, that EKU has probably the best EMC program anywhere around. A cooperation between the police department and that program would be enormously useful, both in terms of getting advice from them on structuring programs, and also recruiting folks who could be of when they graduate of some use. It's a good program. Everything it suffers from the same problem that all of this does, which is that it has to be. We have to fund it and make it usable. It has to be easily accessible, and that requires some work. Yeah.
The other thing that I wanted to note is I appreciate you talking about the training and the education part. I had my undergraduate with you as one of my professors, and the graduate, I don't know that I had you in our PELP program, but I think you have participated with our PELP program with our partnership with EKU over the past couple of years. I think that's a critical component of all this. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
We do, and frankly, those programs, those classes that are offered primarily to Lexington officers in the master's program are really good classes, and they tend to be pretty good students. And it's fun because we get to argue a lot, so that at least keeps everyone amused.
Yeah, good lenses to look through for sure. So thank you.
Thank you. Judge Murphy.
Just real quick, and I'm glad you called because I was actually, Chief Maynard and I don't know if he has part of my brain or whatever, but I was going to bring up the community paramedicine just because that's what I previously worked with. But one of the things also piggybacking with Ms. Bayard, so I think one of our recommendations, and I know you're not telling us what to do, but using some of the data that you already have and kind of giving that to the mayor to then focus funding on that safety net that you just said, as far as if we adequately, and I don't know if we ever can truly adequately, but help fund a safety net, basically have more mental health professionals, more rehab centers, more places, our homeless centers, then maybe we can steer the police calls from that. And I think that community paramedicine program is something that's a great model that we've been using in Lexington. It has got wonderful accolades, but how we can then turn that to how police department could use. So it would that something, I don't know if Brian finished that question, whether that's something that you think that we should be able to to use to focus money, as you said, that's needed.
Absolutely, because those are precisely the kind of programs that need to be expanded and be made accessible. Let's face it, we don't have guaranteed health care. I talked to Jessica Corsoni about policing in Finland and Norway and Sweden and Germany, where they do have guaranteed health care, where they do have easy access to mental health and drug treatment, where they do have guaranteed housing and a reasonably high or higher minimum income than we have here, where they do have free university education. It's a whole lot easier to police a country like that than it is with one with a whole lot of problems and access to necessary services like drug rehab, like mental health, like simple health problems becomes difficult and hard for people to. You don't want to put roadblocks up for people trying to get help, but when you actually talk about expanding it, you are talking about some money.
Any other questions? Just by, Ms. Queen, yes.
Thank you. I wanted to, I've often wondered this about the correlation between, community policing and being able to have and build those great relationships and also seek out alternatives and have actual alternatives available for things to happen right at the moment that it goes on, because it, after it happens, it's too late. We're moving on to the next thing and everything's in the rearview mirror, and it creates a lot of problems. And one of I'm often wondered, like, the correlation between having, first of all, a lot of community court alternatives, being able to, put that in a framework where, that the police officers that are actually participating in that, and also not to have just officers limited as community resource officers, that everyone is trained, in that community policing concept, and not only just trained in it, but also the opportunity to actually do something with it. And I wonder if there's a correlation, Dr. Carter, if you know of, between the existence of how many community courts really exist in a community, how many of those wraparound services are, just available within that type of framework. Because we know that drug court has been pretty successful. We know that, there's veterans courts, there's mental health courts, there's all these specialty courts that, really have shown a lot of promise from my personal opinion. But I wonder if there's a correlation between the success of community policing and the opportunity for those community courts to exist.
I'm not sure it correlates directly with community policing, but the existence, for example, of drug courts does reduce police-citizen hostile interactions considerably. I'm trying to think of a nice, I'll just be straightforward. The criminal justice system has something in it which everyone should be using, maybe more than they do now. Police, judges, prosecutors all have enormous discretion. Police can choose not to arrest. Police can choose to refer to a drug court, to a drug rehab center. Drug courts could choose not to imprison, to set terms of care that are reasonable and attainable. Prosecutors could choose not to prosecute. They could simply say it's just not necessary in this case. I think what we were trying to get at is the idea that in a system of procedural justice or community justice, community policing, that discretion should be widely exercised, but that there should be alternatives readily available that make it possible to exercise it. And formal alternatives like drug courts are certainly one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just as a follow-up, it is that very discretion that lends itself to systemic racism, is it not, Dr. Potter?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Any other questions? Is it too much of an imposition, Dr. Potter, for me to ask you if after reflection, you think of anything else that, oh, I see Dr. Price, you had a question. And before I lead into that, I just want to ask Dr. Potter, if you think of anything else, you let us know. And if any of these members of the committee think of anything else, can they shoot you a private email?
Certainly. The only emails I don't answer anymore are from university administrators.
Okay, Dr. Price.
No, I had the same point as you, Jennifer, about discretion. I mean, it's this wide ability to use discretion where we often see stark differences in the ways in which these diversionary programs are accessible to people of color. I think that bears out in some of the information we have already. And Ms. Fogel also has made this point, I think, multiple times. So the question of discretion is a great one if you have dealt with issues around bias and biased treatment of citizens up into the use of that discretion. There's tons of reporting about the ways in which children are taken out of Black homes, much more likely for the same actions than they would be children in white. I mean, everywhere in the system where discretion is possible, that discretion is used in a discriminatory way against people of color. So I'm not as, I respect the point about how discretion can be used in a positive way, but that positivity does not often come for people of color who have been driving much of the protests around their engagement with law enforcement.
Yeah, just an observation on my part. If I had to say in a system where we're looking for systemic racism and inflection points at which racism exists and just festers, the first word that would come to my mind is discretion. Where there is discretion without objective criteria, measurable criteria, you have the opportunity for systemic racism. And that's not, again, we're about systems and not people. You know, we're about 4:25. I asked you, Dr. Potter, to let us know if you think of anything else. I would ask the committee members. You have Dr. Potter's email address. I forwarded to you his presentation today so you could look at it in advance. And his email address is on that email I forwarded to you. And then I would tell the public, and we really haven't mentioned this, I don't think today, any emails to this subcommittee should come to this address, racialjustice@lexingtonky.gov. racialjustice@lexingtonky.gov. Mr. Cozart, what else do we need to talk about today? Today's Thursday, July 30th. Monday, the 3rd of August, we hear from Damon Preston, who is the state DPA. What else, Mr. Cozart?
Yeah, thank you, Brother Potter and this committee. I'm glad I didn't get to give much input today because, quite frankly, virtue is zapped out of me when you hear the fact that at every point of damn discretion that African Americans come up short. So I have to tell you, I didn't need to be talking much today. I've lost a little bit of my ability for what little ability of diplomacy that I have. So thank you, guys. Thank you. It's a tough feeling to feel empty and heavy simultaneously.
You know, we have a meeting Monday at 4 o'clock, 4 to 5:30. As I said, the state DPA will be here. Tuesday, thank you, Ms. Hatfield, for reminding me. We have a town hall. Several of you have volunteered and nominated other people, and Mr. Cozart and I discussed it and have asked Dr. Price, and she has agreed to be, along with us, our committee's representative at that town hall. The town hall runs from 6:30 to 8 on Tuesday night, the 4th of August. We'll have just a regular committee meeting on the 6th where we don't have a guest speaker, but then on the 10th, at Councilwoman Masadi's good suggestion, we will have people here to discuss the collective bargaining agreement, the process of collective bargaining, and the FOP. Jonathan Bastian from the FOP and Dave Barbieri, I think, from the law department will be here. And that should be a good discussion. You have more homework. Brianna Pursley has sent each one of us a video of an earlier meeting where those two folks talked. Let's look at that. And I sent you the points at which you can see their discussions. It's a long meeting and you can see the points at which they discuss things. Anything else that we need to talk about today? Anything at all? Okay, thank you everybody for such good preparation and great questions. And again, Dr. Potter, we just can't thank you enough for your interest and your presentation today. Thank you. Thank you.